I'm Jane Brown. I have the pleasure of being a professor here in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, also working on our Interdisciplinary Health Communication Certificate, and I teach the course in Interdisciplinary Health Communication in the fall. So it is great pleasure today to have Mike Slater here. Mike is really one of the founders of health communication in the country. He's won an award for that, actually, and he has been the head of the Health Communication Division at the International Communication Association. And Francesca, we better find you a chair.
Yeah, I'm good. You're right here. She's here.
All right. He has a Stanford PhD, and then he spent about 14 years at Colorado State in psychology and technical communication. Most recently, he is at Ohio State University, where he is the Social and Behavioral Science Distinguished Professor. He has had a long history of funded research on alcohol, violence, and cancer. And today he's going to talk about his program of research on cancer. So welcome, Mike. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the hospitality of everybody I've had a chance to spend time with today. And I've talked today about some work I've been doing in the cancer area. I want to acknowledge some colleagues who were part of this effort. Andrew Hayes and Jason Reinecke at Ohio State, Merle Long at Colorado State, and Irv Beddinghouse at Cleveland. This work was supported by NCI and IAAA. Before I kind of launch into what I'm going to talk about today, I just want to kind of put it in the context of work I've been involved with currently. Probably the biggest project I'm involved with right now is its national field trial of media-based adolescent substance abuse prevention. We have media in schools and in the community looking out to the multi-level effects, and also kind of factorially across and looking at how much the extent to which we have synergies there.
You just say restart later.
Restart later, well, good.
Yeah, it keeps popping up.
Okay, well, that'll just keep me on my toes, right? Okay. And we had a very successful original research project on that, and this is in the competing continuation we're now involved with. Doing a lot of work right now on design of prevention messages and looking at substance advertising. One of the things I'm really interested in right now is how do messages work, and in particular, how do they work in non-rational ways, particularly working with adolescents. Betting on rationality is usually not a good bet. Another area that I'm doing a lot of work is on longitudinal process and the role that media are conceptualized as part of the social identity process and how that can impact health behavior. I'll talk a little bit about that in the context of the study toward the end of this talk. And I've also done a bunch of work recently on the nature of the effects of coverage of alcohol on alcohol-related injuries and crime in the news media. What I'm talking about today is focused on research on media and cancer. And it's a series of studies that I've been involved with over the last 5 or 6 years, primarily looking at news, but also looking at some entertainment media effects. And is looking at both content descriptively and also at population-based evidence for some of the possible effects. And I thought this would be the right thing to focus on given I'm here at JOMC and Lineberger people are here. So it's going to be a good combination. First study in the series was based on a content analysis. It was looking at tobacco issues. Now, coverage of tobacco issues matters. Tobacco control is highly policy intensive. In the last 5 to 8 years, there's state after state has been confronting workplace restrictions on smoking, bar restaurant restrictions. There's been it's been a hot political issue in many states. So it becomes sort of an interesting thing to look at what coverage has been like. And there's been a number of attempts to do this, but we really wanted to try to provide what we could really consider data set that we think is really unique. What we tried to do was to create a nationally representative sample of local news. Now, this is not an easy or trivial task. So I'll talk in some detail about how we did it. But we did a sample for 2002 and 2003 of television, both national and local, daily newspapers, again, focusing on local. We also had USA Today in there, and news magazines. Let me talk about how we did it, because we're proud of it. It was a big project. What we did was, okay, you've got newspapers scattered through communities of all sizes. And so how do you go about getting a sensible way to do a sampling design? Designated market areas are pretty much how the advertising world divides up media in the U.S. You can think of them as media markets. If you're not familiar with the concept, picture where the TV station is, and then draw the broadcast radius, and you've pretty much got a general idea of what a media market might look like. So again, there's 210 of them in the U.S., covering about 99.5% of the U.S. population. There are a few people who live outside of these things that are like living on islands of the Aleutians and places like that. So we took these DMAs, 210 of them, and divided them into 6 strata. Each of them containing about 1/6 of the U.S. population. So the first strata, by market size, first strata would be New York, Chicago, and LA. You take the population of the media markets that comprise New York, Chicago, and LA. You take that population size and take it down to the smallest communities. There'd be about 100 DMAs. So strata 6 would be over 100 DMAs. So we have equal population in each strata and varying numbers of newspapers to sample. So obviously, the sample is more precise for the larger than for the smaller. But it did give people themselves an equal opportunity to be in each strata size. We use constructed months, so that if you were familiar with content analysis, are very familiar with these. Basically, it counterbalances seasonality and day of week, which are both important in variation in news coverage. So you have each season of the year, winter, spring, summer, fall, and take a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and so on from each one. So you have seven from each season, 28 for a year, 2 years, you got 54 days, 2 constructed months each. We sampled a local news broadcast from each of these DMAs. And we also sampled, most DMAs have one major central city newspaper. A few of the bigger ones will have competing papers. And then we just randomly sample which one that would be. For the smaller papers, we rank ordered all the dailies in the DMA by circulation size to convenience split, rounding sampled one from the top half, one from the bottom half. So if you figure there's 6 strata, 3 papers per strata, you have 18 papers per day, and 54 days. You wound up with about 1,000 newspapers in total, 550 news programs. And for the various reliabilities I'll talk about, they were all within a pretty healthy range. And just to summarize some of the findings, first descriptively, level of coverage is fairly modest considering that tobacco was a pretty hot issue, particularly in the instances of the days of the real launch of a lot of the major prevention efforts. We had about 21 TV news items about tobacco in the 550 programs, 17 items in magazines. About 1 in 3 newspaper editions had at least some story about tobacco-related issues. So it was non-trivial, but not overwhelmingly large. What was much more interesting is what was in there, and the points that I want to focus on. I'm doing kind of a quick synopsis. I think the most interesting point that we found was first the major themes, which were on one hand negative health effects, on the other hand the government law, policy, regulation kind of story. What was unfortunate and not surprising but unfortunate was that they don't tend to co-occur. You either got a story about news effects, you got a story about the politics of the initiative or what have you. So what seemed to be happening is that tobacco stories, when the initiatives got launched, changed from being health stories to being one more political football that was in play. And it went from reporters who were knowledgeable about health, to reporters who were really concerned only about the politics of whose view would prevail and whose axe was being gored. And the issues of public health and of negative consequences tended to drop out of the stories. So what it signaled was a real concern, particularly for public health advocates, and how the stories are getting played and how they're communicating these stories, because it's not, it was losing sight of the whole purpose for these stories. It's not surprising that it happened, but it certainly poses a challenge to advocates and public health people who are working with the press. So anyway, it's in tobacco control if you're interested for the full details. We took the same sample and said, okay, we also want to look at cancer coverage as a whole. And again, I'm going to just hone in on a few key findings that I think are of interest, or that I found of particular interest. I used to teach a journalism program, and at least obviously there's a lot of talk about civic journalism and particularly local coverage. What news is actionable, what news people can use, kind of reporting, and especially for things that were kind of feature-oriented. And for cancer, the most actionable news, the stuff you can do about it, which is prevention behavior, detection behavior, were not very commonly covered. You had about 7% of stories having some mention of prevention, about 10% about detection, and there's a fair amount of overlap between those two. I see similar findings for TV. Now, that's not great news. I think it's particularly interesting given that policymakers also read the paper. When you're reading about an issue like cancer, what's salient, what's being reported is what's important. If cancer control is really a fairly low profile, it's not a very helpful thing for cancer control folks. The other question we looked at was that of the level of coverage relative to morbidity and mortality numbers. I was curious, what would be coverage of different cancer sites relative to what the actual numbers tell you about the public health problem. And again, this is interesting because it's likely to impact funding of those with behavior. And what we found was, essentially advocacy works. Breast cancer has an extraordinarily well-developed advocacy network, and it is reflected as you look at the numbers. The red bar is newspaper coverage, and this is the proportion of coverage on the topic. The gray bar is 2003 incidence, and the black bar is mortality. And what you see is breast cancer gets a very considerable share of coverage, substantially higher than you would predict from incidence, and far higher than you would predict from mortality. The differences in some of the other ones are there, but they're not really dramatic. They're somewhat dramatic in terms of incidence, but not mortality for prostate. Lung cancer is rather dramatically off the radar screen. And what's interesting is that I didn't put the table in here, and we're still playing with it. But if you look at the NCI funding numbers for the same year, they track coverage much better than they track incidence or mortality. That does not mean that it's, I don't want to assert that we have this super strong causal relationship. They track each other, but the common factor there, is advocacy. The same advocates who are pushing information in the papers are also pushing funding priorities, and no doubt the coverage plays into that. But it would be highly simplistic to suggest that it's, somehow a one-to-one direct function of media coverage. But it certainly is part of that picture. Okay, so since I'm kind of a prevention-oriented person in a lot of my research and my intervention work tends to be focused on various areas of prevention. I was really interested in this issue of this low profile of prevention in news, and what could we expect given that? And one of the things I wanted to look at was to get this out of descriptive kind of analysis, which are fun, but they're just a starting place, and to look at some effects work. And in fact, one of the things I was particularly interested in, knowledge gap issues, which are familiar to most of you. Most of you are. Knowledge gap is about ways in which information in the social system can serve to potentially exacerbate existing disparities. It doesn't make, that the basic notion is people who, the haves, people who have education, have access, have money for newspaper subscriptions, time to read the paper, are going to benefit disproportionately from resources directed towards providing information generally to the information environment, unless, of course, you're really trying to compensate for that by disproportionately trying to serve the underserved. Now, there's a fair amount of research of various kinds that's supportive of this knowledge gaps in general, and some of the work that Vish Vishwanath and John Finnegan have done in health in particular. Not very many are based on national data sets. There's not a lot of cancer, and at least none that I know of that are specifically in cancer prevention. There's methodological issues. A lot of it is based on self-report. And the longer I'm in this business, the less comfortable I am with relying unduly on self-reports of media exposure. People have reasons for what they report, and they're often confounded with what you want to look at. So I was interested in trying to give this a tougher and more rigorous kind of test in a certain sense, which was to actually look at actual differences in coverage based on content analysis. And ask, does it impact cancer knowledge? And more important, does it contribute, can it be used as a way of assessing the presence or absence of knowledge gaps on the cancer prevention issue? Again, for those of you who are less familiar with this area, it's a fairly high stakes issue in the cancer world. There are behaviors that are can be quite efficacious in reducing cancer risk. Sunscreenings, 5-a-day eating of fruits and vegetables. And we're a long ways from having these kind of behaviors well accepted, especially among underserved populations. So we wanted to, again, look at the consequences of possible implications of these issues we talked about. Okay, so just, a first kind of main effects hypothesis for getting the knowledge gap phenomenon would simply be where you've got your cancer prevention coverage more salient, it's a greater proportion of coverage, it's more visible, people will be more aware of cancer prevention information, more knowledgeable than those who aren't in such regions. More interesting one to us is knowledge gap, given that the more educated, greater access, greater fluency in reading, greater schematic, are more schematic with respect to health issues, and be better able to process and comprehend. That we'd expect, again, this knowledge gap phenomenon, where you're seeing stronger effects for the more educated than for the less educated. There's another thing I wanted to look at, and this is a little less intuitive, so I'm going to have to try to hand wave and explain and see if it makes sense. If it doesn't, then I failed in trying to explain it. The attention to a genre of story and knowledge is bound to be related. Right? But the question is that relationship stronger or weaker when you've got more coverage or a greater concentration of coverage? It might be stronger if people are paying more attention to the story, and so if you're already motivated If you're motivated to pay more attention to the story, and there's more stories there, you get more. So what it means is that people who are already paying attention are typically more educated. If you're poor, basically, the reality is health is typically not the first problem you have. It may be paying the rent that month or getting food on the table that day. Being focused on processing and attending to health stories is going to be a problem. So if that relationship with attention is dependent on having more stories, it's not very encouraging in terms of what happens if you increase resources to the underserved in terms of information. Conversely, if that relationship is weaker, when there's more coverage available, and there's some research in political communication that suggested something very similar to this. It would suggest that when you have more coverage, it basically means you don't have to look so hard to find it. You're more likely to run into it, you're more likely to receive it. And for that to make sense, part of it is attention is one of those concepts that can be used to mean several things. If you're thinking one definition, it can be confusing. Often I think about attention as cognitive effort engaged in processing a message, which is kind of the experimental sense of attention. But if you're thinking about when you ask people how much attention do you pay to a certain kind of news story, my own sense is, it may have some of that element, but you're mostly saying is people stay on news. When you're scanning news, do you notice these kind of, do you look for these kind of stories? When you're choosing, it's almost a selective exposure kind of question in a way. Are you looking for and finding those stories? And presumably if you do, pay more attention to some of who doesn't. So what it suggests is you don't have to be looking so hard, to find it. Okay, so what we did was we took the same content analysis and we combined it with national survey data using the HINTS National Random Digit Dial Survey. I'll tell you more about that in a second for those of you who aren't familiar with it. We looked at the presence or absence of a cancer story, and when you have 1,000 newspapers, and part of our idea was not to just take those stories that are available online for computerized collection. We wanted, for a random sample, we're pulling papers from Aberdeen, South Dakota, things that you're not going to find online anywhere. And so we had to read them all. Good employment opportunity for a lot of graduate students, but it took a while. And so we did coder checks for liability actually 4 times in the process.
You actually had the paper? It was on paper?
Yeah, I mean, these things only exist in the form of paper. Somebody was on the phone tracking down papers for each of these papers, each of these places. I have them all in airlocked bags in a locked room because nothing else like this exists in the country, as far as I know. And actually, one of the things I wanted sometime to do is find a political communication to say, look, I actually went back and got to it 2 months previous, so I got it from November 2001. For the 2 years following. So I want somebody to say, there's a mine of how people started to make sense of 9/11 in that room. But that's not something I have the time and resource to look at right now. So saving it with somebody who wants to. The pulled out the topic, including prevention, double-coded presented stories, and got decent reliability on it. Okay, the trick here was to combine the data sets. So you could do a multi-level model analysis. And the trick there is for the upper level. For those who aren't familiar, it's essentially a hierarchical analysis where you have a kind of regression models for the upper cluster, for the upper level geographic variable, one for the individuals nested within this geographic area. And you have to create enough units at that level that you have some ability to detect variability. So, but we also had limited number of stories and limited number of respondents, so we couldn't get too many of them. We had to try to find something that was adequate in number, but reasonably homogeneous within group and different between groups. So what we did was we took those 6 strata and figured there's 4 major divisions in the U.S. and kind of crossed them. So we had 24, except there's no mega city in the south, so it became the 23. The notion being, think, cities about the size of Charlotte in the south are more similar than they are different to cities of different sizes in the south and cities of the same size, say, in the west. And it makes for a conservative test. There's a lot of heterogeneity within those groups. But at the same time, there was real variance and differentiation there. The other question was, what kind of metric? And I had said, our interest was relative salience of prevention. And was particularly also was useful because doing counts of stories makes no sense. For one thing, if you got a big paper, you could get a bigger count. On the other hand, a single story in a big paper probably means less, because if you're in a small town, reading the 6 pages in the newspaper, you're probably going to see everything. Hardly anyone's going to see everything that's in a large metro paper. So looking at the percentage of cancer stories that contain prevention coverage seemed like it provided us a uniform metric and one that was responsive to that concern about the relative salience of prevention. Used the 2003 National Health Information National Trend Study, or HINTS. NCI does this. It was done right in the middle of our content analysis, so the timing was perfect. The 2007 one, they do it every 2 years. It's online, fully public available, your taxpayer dollar paid for it. So if you have an interest in health information seeking and cancer and media, cancer knowledge, it's a great resource. And I say 2007 just came out, I think within the last few weeks. So I really would recommend using it. It's a great thing for classroom methods classes to play with. It does have one of those few statements that text that has really serious measurement of VDEs.
Is it a phone survey?
Yeah.
Phone?
Phone surveys, you have all the problem with phone surveys these days. The response rate is not impressive, and it's probably less impressive if you recognize that's probably, I think it's adjusted for, it's probably like a response rate 3, it's probably like adjusted for instance rates. But it was a long survey, so I think they had, it was challenging to get people to respond. We took the measures of education, which was basically 4 levels of not high school grad, so on. They have an extensive knowledge kind of inventory, and we took the codes for the knowledge items about prevention, measure of attention to health and related news. And then we matched it to the DMAs. We matched it to content analysis, the DMAs. Now, to do that, I guess, I know some people with content analysis here, so I'll take some detail on this stuff, is the survey, like if you know surveys, most surveys have FIPS codes, which are county codes. And counties can map on to DMAs with a fair amount of accuracy. So we created a code to translate FIPS codes into DMAs. NCI does not put FIPS codes on a public data set because it's too close to identifying for their tastes. But they agreed that DMAs were broad enough to be non-identifying, so they were willing, once we gave them our code, to translate FIPS codes from DMA. So they included DMA in the field in the data set. I don't know if they've done it for subsequent months. I kind of hope they have, but I haven't looked. So that's something, if you're interested, you might want to check out. Okay, there's some technical details in the multi-level model for those of you who may be multi-level model fans, and those of you who aren't. I won't read that bullet. The technical issue that I think was more interesting was treating education, almost all knowledge gap stuff, either dichotomize education, or perhaps if they're more sophisticated, treated as a continuous variable, as an interaction. But Andrew Hayes, who did the data analysis, is very interested in ordinal models and said, look, we can't assume it's a linear kind of process. So we looked at dummies for each step of that 4 levels of education, and the betas were very different. And so we treated it as an ordinal variable. That was not a problem for attention, and there was variation at the upper level clusters. So we could go ahead. It looked at first like we even had an effect for that main effect, which was sort of secondary interest. And certainly after doing all the individual control. But when you have a multi-level model, you can't just control for the individual level stuff. there are differences, of course, at the geographic level. And we had limited data, obviously, on these constructed regions, but we had enough people in each region to be able to make an estimate aggregating from the people surveyed in each region as to what's the average level of education, what's the average attention to news. So if you're thinking about it, you may have mid-sized cities in the West where you have a relatively high level of education, much more health-oriented kind of culture, so that people with the same education living in one area in a culture that's more health-oriented are probably going to have more cancer knowledge. That's an obvious potential confine. And when we put in that control into the model, our effect for the overall main effect was dropped to non-significance. Then we went to the knowledge gap hypothesis, and there we did the same test, again with all of the controls at both levels, and that one held up just fine. It was a pretty clean result, and we also went and looked at the education ordinally, and it held up. And one of the things that was interesting there was that where the difference was, it was for the knowledge gap effect, was with people who've been to college or not. It was not at all a linear effect. And you can see that in the next slide. On the far side, by the y-axis, you have a relatively small proportion of cancer prevention content in the news. You see sizable differences by education, but they really spread out, especially between college and no college, when you have a relatively high proportion. So for those of us who teach undergraduates sometimes, that's reassuring. Even the ones who don't pay much attention to leave college seem to get something out of the whole deal. Another question was about our research, about attention. And we again asked that question about, is the effect of attention smaller or larger when you have more coverage? And kind of as we kind of hoped, it was, and somewhat counterintuitively, it's smaller. And that was significant and stays significant even when we put both interactions in the model. And they weren't linear and somehow artifact of each other in some odd way. So just to wrap it up, the support, I think, for health knowledge gap is kind of uniquely authoritative here because we're basing it on real content differences in the news as measured. We're looking at market level responses and differences, not at self-reports. It's very conservative given the relative size of those clusters, but the effects are holding up. And also, I think what's new too is this recognition that knowledge gap effects aren't necessarily linear. There are certain discontinuities in education where you see these differences more strongly. Another factor is that knowledge gaps are often tested in health around campaigns. This is one that really shows the effects as in political communication are in news. And that attention suggests that increasing prevention coverage for the underserved is likely to be workable. That the effect of having increased coverage doesn't depend on people being particularly attentive and tuned into health news. In fact, it helps compensate for that. People don't have to look as hard for it. And it's really support. Are people familiar with Matt Kreuter's Azioma intervention? It's a really a nice fit, and this really confirmed for me part of the value of that. What he's doing in collaboration with folks at the Missouri J School is they created a news service on cancer for African American newspapers. And so the stories are slanted to address particularly African American issues and also localized to whatever the local city or state's cancer numbers are. And stories go out. And of course, African American papers tend to be terribly understaffed, so there's a lot of welcome for appropriately targeted coverage that's relevant and useful. So they're getting a fair amount of pickup of this stuff. So it's a nice example finding ways to compensate for disparity by subsidizing information going to those who otherwise would get it less. And this will be coming out soon, so if you want to see more details on the study. Take a deep breath here. I've been talking fast and talking all day, and words are starting to swim in my head. This is a change of channel, sort of figuratively in the sense literally. I've had an ongoing interest in entertainment issues and effects of entertainment, both pro-social, entertainment education, and sometimes less pro-social. And it's particularly of interest in the tobacco world. Jim Sargent and his group have done some interesting work that suggests that viewing of our movies by teens is a very strong predictor after using a whole lot of controls and models for teen smoking uptake. And this is, and again, he does a lot of stuff where he has done some very intricate analyses of content, and not just sort of pulled out how often you see movies, but looking at the relationship between the amount of the kind of movies that have greater smoking portrayal, which they've coded, and linking that to smoking uptake. So it's really interesting stuff. Well, it turns out there are some content analyses out there looking at music videos, MTV, VH1, and there's a lot of smoking going on, a lot of cigarette in music videos, a lot of other substances too, which is a subject I'm sure for future analysis. But I started with the tobacco here. And so the question was, what about some of the potential for music video impact? And I want to take a little time about some of the thinking here, because there's a tendency to default to social cognitive theory to explain any kind of effect of an entertainment exposure. And I'm a fan of social cognitive theory, and I think it's a wonderful model. But I'm not sure it's the whole story or even often the right story. It's just what we have available. And so I think there are other ways to look at it. I think that may have a lot more to do with the role media actually plays in people's lives. Monkey see, monkey do is not necessarily the best way to understand the role of media for adolescents. One argument I've made is that the role of media for adolescents, to a great extent, is as a kind of an element of social influence. And I think music video, TV, is especially interesting. Because when you have this kind of window into pop culture, which is what a music video program is about. It's kind of a smorgasbord of popular music and the videos associated with them. You can view it in the safety and comfort of your home. You don't have to be hanging out with anybody to be exposed to these kind of influences. And, you can do it in your room if you're like one of the many American kids who have TVs in their room. And what it seemed to me would be plausible. It'd be a way for a younger teen to kind of, younger teens are in the process of course, de-individuating their identity from parental influences to their more peer-based kind of relationship association. You see that your social development model or peer-socialization model kind of are nice models for describing this. So it seemed to me that this is a kind of an interesting possible transition to moving into peer groups who may be a little bit deviant in terms of what parents might like to see. And this, I've talked about reinforcing spiral models where people, especially young people, may use media to help shape an emerging social identity, and that identity evolves. You wind up turning more and more to the media that reinforce it, and it becomes kind of a self-perpetuating relationship that helps sustain a kind of a social identity formation. So given that kind of argument, would argue certainly that early MTV viewing should predict both increases in friends who smoke and increase in teen smoking, and that the effects on the increasing rate of teen smoking should be mediated by the increases in friends who smoke. What we use to test this, the four-wave a remarkable data set. Government spent about $35 million on its contracting to Westat, in-home, computer-assisted. This was to evaluate the national marijuana campaign, which many of you have seen or are familiar with. But they also had some questions about other substances, including smoking. One of the interesting things about this data set is that they also interviewed parents in the household to be able to link parental data to youth data. Now, this is actually a really interesting opportunity, in part because this research is kind of following in Jim Sargent's line of work, in a sense, although a different kind of approach. And there's a couple of questions I've always had about that work, which I like. One of them is he does a lot of controlling, say, for parenting style, but having worked a fair amount with adolescent and substance issues, parenting style is important, but for the kind of issues we're looking at, parental monitoring, how much you actually control, how much your kid goes out, where they go, what time they come home, is probably a lot more important. Because if a fear would be, well, kids are influenced by our movies, but if they go to our movies, they're not supervised very much. It's really the lack of supervision. It's really an indicator of lack of supervision. So it seemed to me looking at, first, parental monitoring and controlling for that would help address that possible explanation. And second, music, MTV is not subject to that because there's a lot less monitoring involved with adolescent TV viewing than there is with going to see our movies. To analyze these data, four-wave data series, we use parallel processing and growth models, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining them technically, but conceptually they're actually quite simple in terms of what you get to look at. You have baseline values, and you have trajectories for outcomes, and you can predict trajectories from baseline. And you also can look at your predictor over originally your independent variable and look at its trajectory and ask are the trajectories correlated over time. So I can talk about some of what we found and some of the key findings and some of the more interpretive findings and how I've interpreted them. And I will note that, I mean, we're literally still working on these analyses at the moment, and they look stable. And this is what we've got so far. Is that baseline MTV VH1 viewing predicts the trajectory of increasing cigarette smoking trends. It predicts increasing cigarette use, and it increases, and in fact, the smoking trends mediates the effect on smoking uptake. And again, the controls were a pretty decent set, including the parental ones that I described. Now, there's some interesting findings here too when we looked at the correlations over time. One thing is that there are correlations between MTV viewing over time, as that increases, and smoking, they don't track significantly. Now, this is really interesting. For one thing, it really is not what you'd expect to find from a social cognitive point of view. If it's a modeling, you should see the ongoing relationship between the modeling and the behavior. The question is it also inconsistent with the spirals notion? Shouldn't kids, if they're getting involved with these groups, then turn around and watch more MTV? Well, actually, no. Unfortunately, it's not a speculative argument. A guy, Van der Wright and his group, actually did a study on peer social group formation and the role of MTV. And it happens in 2000. And what he found was that what adolescents, as they become involved in increasingly well-identified social groups, find music genres that are specific to those groups, and that's what they start focusing on. I mean, MTV is kind of like pop culture 101. It's a survey course in popular music. When you're turning into, a skateboarder or whatever you're turning into, your group is going to have its kind of music. In this day and age, that would mean you're doing downloads, for the kind of music you want. Back in the first half of this decade, when this research was collected, the most common thing he would do would be listen to the radio station that plays your kind of music. And sure enough, what you find is a positive correlation between the smoking uptake and increasing radio use. So I think you're getting that effect of people moving to media that supports the identity, but it means actually migrating. Yeah?
I'm not sure I'm following. Let me see if I just want to see if I understand
Sure.
the data. So you're saying the baseline MTV watching is correlated with baseline or with subsequent?
The baseline predicts subsequent trajectory.
Your subsequent trajectory. Then.
Right.
Okay. And so do you really believe it's watching MTV, or do you believe that MTV watching sort of stands for something? I'm the kind of person who watches MTV. Or is there something implicit that I watch MTV and I just can't take it and I need a cigarette?
No, that'd be for an alcohol thing.
I mean,
That's for an alcohol thing.
and I know you're not really saying that last thing. You're saying something sort of in between. That watching MTV causes, and then
Actually, I mean, I'm glad I think you're underscoring the argument I was trying to make earlier, and I guess I didn't make it clearly enough. That the social cognitive theory kind of model would be saying that what you see in that content, by virtue of that content, causes this effect because you're modeling it and all these sexy hot people are smoking, and so you want to smoke too, is kind of a social cognitive theory. And again, I wouldn't dispute it's a good model. It's not what I think is perhaps the primary dynamic, in which case, yes, it's standing for something, but not as a proxy. That it's part of it, that in a way is trying to describe a socialization process. And because the question, so in a sense, you wanted to ask a tougher question, given my argument, would be, okay, since it's part of a socialization process and it's not the thing in itself, well, if you took it away, would that process not happen? Are you saying that people aren't going to find kids who smoke? And obviously, people have done it long before there was MTV. What I would tend to argue is, and it's my basic sense of the role of media typically. I am not really comfortable often thinking of media as a kind of standalone exogenous kind of variable that is doing things to people. It's a social influence in a social context as part of it. And my sense in this case, it facilitates it. It perhaps accelerates it. It kind of lubricates that process of moving out to these kind of peer groups, potentially.
So, I mean, I don't want to take too far from your talk.
No, this is right on. This is right on.
Do you think that, for example, then it's a general phenomenon that it would be true for radio, or would also be true, say, for Facebook, which is certainly more on the social end and certainly media, but not necessarily broadcasting?
Well, I think Facebook serves a very similar function. It's a way to move away from your family-centered, parent-centered experience to a peer-centered experience, but the content that you experience on Facebook is largely self-determined. The content you get on MTV is not self-determined. It's determined by the producers of music videos. And basically, music videos thrive by pushing the envelope. So you're getting a lot of representation of substance use, perhaps more than anywhere else you're going to see on television. At least anywhere in any kind of non-cable. Yeah.
So when you're tracking MTV, are you seeing or counting how many times cigarettes appear in the music videos, or is it just MTV?
This was MTV. The content analyses have already been done on that, and you're getting, I think it's like 10–12% of the videos will have some smoking cigarette use. So it's pretty high proportion. The use of alcohol is actually higher than that. So there's a lot of substances in MTV. It's declined a bit actually in the last couple of years. It partly, some of these analyses have been generated a certain amount of public pressure.
Yeah, and that led to an intervention question I had. So if that's the case, have there been campaigns to have people cut their cable unless and force MTV basically out of homes and put them in the pocketbook where they might then make some changes in their content? Have there been attempts to do that? I know that's happening.
That's where, I mean,
happening with movies right now.
yeah.
PG movies.
Well,
the New York Times they've done that.
Yeah, I mean, Spanglass and that group, have been very much part of the move to pressure the industry in terms of smoking. I was involved on the IOM strategies panel, and we've spent a lot of time discussing that issue. It's advocacy helps and it works, and it's part. I mean, if there's a motivation in a study like this, it's to help provide a little grist for that advocacy mill. It's suggestive, but it's a pretty strongly suggestive kind of finding. And then of course the other piece, cutting the cable. There is also parent education component. It's like it's a lot easier with the 13-year-old not to tell them what to watch, but if but there may be prices to pay in not monitoring that. I guess part of where I come from with working with adolescents is the name of the game in prevention of substances is really delay of onset. If a kid is starting to drink, experiment with pot when they're 16, their prognosis is pretty good. If they're starting at 13, 14, it's pretty bad. And anything that kind of cushions that movement is a good thing. How much reducing these kind of influences? Speculative, no one knows. But personally, I'd encourage it based on what I'm seeing. And it's also really consistent, again, it's muddy because parental monitoring is one of the best predictors of lower substance use. And how much of it is because of monitoring matters and how much is because you got to involve parents, that's a question. But it does seem that interventions to teach parents effective monitoring skills do have favorable outcomes. So you're controlled. You're having parents who haven't changed who they are, but are learning to change their behaviors, having more favorable outcomes as they learn the skills of monitoring, which themselves are non-trivial to learn.
You counted for a number of anti-tobacco ads on MTV and VH1. How in time do they appear considering the amount of tobacco use? When these things were run, it was pretty much pre a lot of legacy stuff. There wasn't a lot of that on, and as I said, yeah, I'd be given if the function here is if we're social cognitive, that would make sense. You've got social cognitive messages for and some against. If what's happening is you're re-socializing into a slightly different peer group, a message about smoking really isn't addressing that issue. It's nice that the messages are there, but it's not addressing the same issue. So I'm not sanguine that somehow one fully addresses the other.
So I've been in a defined peer group for a while, so it's been a while since I've watched a lot of MTV. But to the extent that I know, as far as the trend over the last 5 or 6 years, both of those channels have probably become a lot more about reality shows or even VH1 celeb reality. And I think that celeb, they call it celeb reality. They get a bunch of divas to like get in the house and take it out.
We don't have enough.
But I mean, I know this was connected earlier, but do you speculate that affects the nature of the content at all? I mean, certainly there's still a lot of drinking on these shows, but it's just being presented in a different way, and maybe the people are less glamorous because you get to see all the.
Well, like I say, from a social cognitive perspective, that would be a very interesting question. What kind of models are these, and are they, how attractive are they? If it's not a social cognitive question, maybe not. But again, it is a somewhat different phenomenon than it was 4 or 5 years ago. And so if we're this data available running now, will we get the same results? Maybe. I hope so, I don't know. Great questions. Any other questions?
It sounds to me, and I might be mistaken, that
Can you stand up, Francesca?
It sounds like, in a way, MTV is sort of like a gateway drug for this particular age group, the group that's going, no, I don't want to be like my parents anymore, I need to go find who I am. Does that mean this model really only applies to that particular group of ages? Like if we were to try to take this and design an intervention to try to get folks beforehand when they're 7 years old or 8 years old and they're still very much, loving their parents and wanting to, be like that. Like, is there anything we can do about that, or like where does it stop applying?
Well, I'm having to extrapolate from data. I can't think of any studies that directly look at that. But I think in general, there's not a lot of evidence. It's certainly a drug group. There's not a lot of evidence for carryover from programs directed at younger kids, pre-adolescent. And I was like, once puberty hits, all bets are off. In terms of, you're talking about really different people. Some of the interventions that have carryover are much more, are the things that do carry over, not attitudes, beliefs about substances, which are bad, horrible, scary things, and else they're not. But life, sort of life skills type stuff. We're training kids in decision making, in in being able to deal with conflict and personal issues. Those kind of skills do translate over across puberty from the few studies I've seen on that. Some of these school interventions that actually focus on those kind of global things and have done so effectively. Apparently, there are effects that cross the hormonal barrier. Education about drugs. I've never seen any evidence that anything you tell a kid pre-puberty has any credibility afterwards. But
those are the DARE programs, right?
Yeah, but I think even other programs, it's just not. It's not. I mean, and you kind of wouldn't really expect that either, because it's being taken on trust for people you no longer paid out. You no longer listed very much. But I think there is reason to believe that still the younger teens, early puberty, is for substances is a good intervention age. That again, with the goal being delay of onset. Part of it is how you go. That's actually been an area where I've done a lot of it. For example, and that's probably this emphasis on thinking about developmental issues. The field study that I've been running, like 8 years now, 9 years, is based on it's an in-school, middle school focused intervention, and the focus, the tagline is "Be under your own influence."
Be what?
Be under your own influence. And the concept was, risks are developmentally appropriate. So telling kids things are risky will discourage kids who are afraid of risk anyway and are least likely to use. But that autonomy is developmentally appropriate. And one thing, Catherine Kelly helped really develop this idea, found over some years of formative, is that even users don't make the claim they're more under their own control, more autonomous, more able to achieve desired goals when they're using it. At best, they'll say, well, it doesn't matter that much. It doesn't really interfere that much. No one argues it's consistent with that. So it's really, the campaign's really focused on autonomy and the fact that, if we're focused on really achieving some autonomy, it's like, this is going to help me. This takes me the wrong way. It's not going to get me where I want to go. And so it has a lot of credibility. So it's that notion of just if the kids, again, the high-risk takers, the kids who are interested in taking risk and achieving autonomy, it's like, this doesn't get you where you're trying to go, even in terms of breaking away and showing your independence. And again, it seems, at least in the first iteration, it has some decent effects.
it has exactly what it influenced. You know, if you follow the marijuana campaign, it switched from my anti-drug to above the influence. That was about a year or two after we presented this stuff to the campaign. The advertisers plainly, of course, they pay attention to it and thought of themselves, but advertisers can never get an idea from a researcher. That would be terrible. Terrible thing. So.
And did you start this campaign about substance abuse started in early adolescence?
It's basically starts in middle school, sixth, 7th, 8th grade. And that's a good age because what you see is substance use of all kinds. I mean, cigarettes, it slides a little more to it cheats younger, but it's really, on 12 you start it's an S curve, and it's really 15, 16 is a bulge on the S, maybe a little bit younger for cigarette, and so it's like an epidemic kind of strategy. You want to hit where the curve is, where it's moving, but before it inflects. In this case, you're not trying to stop it; you're just trying to shove the point of inflection down, a year or two. But if you do that, that's a very good thing.
Sure. The chart that you had with the tobacco showed the educational differences. So as they go up, because they start at different levels, as they go up, is there any indication that those people who are higher in education supplement the internet at some point? It accelerates the difference?
That's a really good question. In these data, it's all cross-sectional, so you wouldn't know. You can bet that educated people have higher internet use, but whether you're getting information seeking via the internet that may be triggered by these exposures, which is a really plausible scenario. It's not something we can test in data.
If you went to that data set, which is quite large, and went across that bottom column, the knowers, and you could pull out those people, because even in that lower quadrant, the people who are highly, they're up there, but they're lost in the aggregate. If you pulled out all those people and looked at them, would there be anything about those people that are different as the type of people? I mean, because there's an awful lot of socioeconomic background in that probably. If they start that far apart, there must be a major socioeconomic factor at work there somewhere.
Yeah. Well, that's in terms of knowledge. So as you'd expect, the more educated, you're going to start from higher knowledge. That was not a time base. That was rather the increment of response with respect to the increment of proportion of knowledge. But the point you're making about I think the supplementary behavior is a really important one because, in a sense, and it's what always happens as a technology increases information access, it disproportionately advantages those who are more competent at using it. And even when you find studies where you provide computer access widely, what you do find is that there's just a lot more sophistication in how to milk information out of the system based on education. And it takes actually a fair amount of training to learn how to get and to critically assess the information you get off the net. So you are, I think, net is a classic one. Even though access has really increased tremendously in underserved populations, the ability to utilize that effectively is still.
If you look at the allocation of cigarette stuff across media, I've often wondered how that mix of news on the front page beyond just cigarette. Because within the health category, there's an agenda competition going on.
Sure.
And it never, because if you read a lot of content analysis studies, many of them come down to this statement. Finally, dear reader, I would like to point out in summary that the newspapers only had X% of news about women, or about Chinese, or about old people. And everybody starts from, I've always wondered what the proper amount of distribution would be. You'd take 1/8 of the news should be about China, and half about women, and so forth. So that because those formula fits, even though you might find little variation, tremendously stable across time. if you move up the level of abstraction.
Right. And that was one reason why what we've tended to do with these content analyses that I think is more informative is look at differences between sort of epidemiological frequency and what you actually find in the news. And that is often a lot more informative, and it's one thing I would like to do more of is to see how well that tracks public perception and understanding. Actually, I was kind of doing a little hand wave saying one presumes that we're going to see these kind of effects, but to what extent? But an example, I had somebody, I've had people look at that study for intimate partner violence and for, say, suicide. And suicide is maybe 50%, is substantially more common than homicide. We spend a lot of time wrestling with homicide as an issue. And it's not unless somebody in the community killed themselves, there's not that much
that's
dark.
the definition of news. Homicide is a threat. Prevention isn't news.
That's exactly the challenge.
The newspaper's not there for public health purposes. It's there to print the news.
Well, but I think the challenge is, and my own feeling is not a normative one. My own background in public relations, it's somebody is not packaging the story very effectively because, for example, on the cancer topics, as you'd expect, there's a whole lot of stories on celebrity cancers or prominent people in the community of cancer. And the stories are often coming through health channels. There's an opportunity to package that with, the sidebar. These things are opportunities, and they're going by. And so that's, I think, for me, is a little bit more of a takeaway from this.
My question actually relates directly to what Rhonda just said, because I was thinking about the discrepancy between how much breast cancer is covered versus how much lung cancer is covered, and how you say breast cancer is sort of overrepresented in terms of the coverage against.
Well, I say that descriptively and not normatively.
No, compared to its incidence.
Yeah.
And what I'm wondering, and if, based on your reading of the articles, I don't know how much the actual reading of the articles you did, but, because I've seen a lot about the worthy poor and the unworthy poor and the worthy sick and the unworthy sick.
Yeah, it's lung cancer, your own fault.
Exactly. And
yeah.
So I'm wondering how much that plays into why that kind of narrative, why there's so much more about breast cancer, which is an event that falls on somebody seemingly out of the sky in the middle of their life, versus lung cancer, which, well, yeah, you know why you get lung cancer.
It's a better story, but it's also a story that has been very effectively told.
Mm-hmm.
And I would venture to guess that you would see, again, I haven't seen a real historical line on breast cancer coverage, but their advocacy has done a very nice job. And a lot of the stories are about advocacy events.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The Susan Komen run every year, everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Gonna get in the paper. There's, there's the ribbon weeks. There's a lot of those things are designed precisely to gain news coverage.
Mm-hmm.
And it works. It's done well.
But there's also a medical reason, because the prognosis for lung cancer is very poor. There's no really effective intervention. Most people who get it will die. Whereas with breast cancer, there are more effective interventions. So it may be that doing a news story on a cancer where once it's diagnosed, there's really not much you can do about it is not very appealing to health reporters. Whereas for cancers that are treatable, like breast cancer,
that makes a great sense.
That may have an effect. Now, prostate cancer is a different issue, because prostate cancer probably intervention may do more harm than good in many cases. So, why the prostate cancer kind of fell between the lung and the breast cancer in your survey data, right? In terms of coverage?
Prostate was down. It was pretty much.
I don't know if all that follows the. we have a really easy way to get rid of lung cancer, which is to eliminate smoking in the nation. 90% of cases go away, maybe 10% are radon. So it's straightforward, but I will agree it's not used. Maybe that's the case. It's not interesting, but there's a super effective, efficacious way, and that also will take care of a lot of breast cancer as well. But in terms of what breast cancer screening will do, it's not a lot. It'll do a little bit, but it doesn't do a lot.
Right. Oh, well, you're right on the prevention, but I'm talking about the treatment side.
Yeah.
So those are the two issues, I think.
Sort of one other issue, it'd be interesting to look at those column graphs if you did years of potential life loss. Because what happens with lung cancer, it affects people
later in
50,
life.
60s, 70s, and they're not dying prematurely. Breast cancer, it's diagnosed much earlier, 10, 20 years earlier on average. So some of it is very newsworthy that I think you should see disproportionate coverage, but it's still out of whack in general. The other thing I would say, the last thing we've looked at, survivor groups. North Carolina has one of the leading groups in the nation. It's called Survivors of Howard, and it's people who have died, who are dying, or actually, I'm sorry, people affected by tobacco-related illnesses, and they do a lot of advocacy and are in the paper. And it's the reason, one of the reasons they sprung up in North Carolina is because we have such a tobacco industry lobby. We have farmers, and the media advocates wanted to find an authentic voice that would counter the farmer and other groups. And so this is it's a strategy that's employed. But at any rate, I was just meeting with one of the founders of the group last week, and he just says all their lung cancer survivors die so rapidly that they have to do laryngectomy patients, basically. So survival is just such a rapid deterioration that explains, I think, part of the.
I think that is key to the story, because I mean, part of it is age-related, but part of it is you don't have survivor groups to be effective advocates.
One last question here.
Do we stop at 3:15, Sri, or 3:30? Oh.
I think people may have to leave. So I don't
Okay, we've had some standing up. So one last question, and then he'll stay for questions for a smaller group. Right?
Yep.
Okay.
I'm not going anywhere.
Yeah.
Actually, you are.
Yeah, you
Also,
go ahead. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask about sort of your take on all these new media and the social networking software and the potential for moving into some of these more specialized peer groupings and, cell phones and the new smartphones, that may be more accessible to people at different social levels. And, do you see some new ways in which these kinds of messages could be disseminated, or new kinds of ways, because it's not all going to be through the formal media or room from information library science, so it's not always going to be through information in libraries or library information services. There's a lot of information, probably much more being transferred in informal ways among people. And we're getting new media with which to do that. It doesn't have to be a computer anymore, which has been very restrictive, but there's all this new stuff coming along.
Well, I was talking to people at lunch about that. I think a number of people in the area think, I think one of the hot areas for intervention is going to be cell phone. American cell phones are relatively primitive relative to which most of the rest of the world. But we're kind of we're kind of moving along the curve.
Have you seen Shree's phone? Ask to see Shree's.
Oh, okay. Shree can demonstrate the capabilities, but yeah. But it's also good too, because in terms of disparities, cell phones are one thing that are widely available. And in fact, if you're poor in this country, you're more likely to have a cell phone than a landline very often. So as they get more capable, in particular, I think there's some really interesting opportunities. And I was talking about, I think some of the blur between media and clinical are going to dissolve, because the opportunity, say, to encourage adherence through mediated reminders, there's no reason why you can't be getting a text message, twice a day if you're supposed to be taking something critical twice a day. There's just a tremendous opportunity. And then the question is, are there ways to frame that message so that it's more motivating? Because it's not just triggering a reminder, but it's also trying to motivate a behavior. So there is a kind of a melding of, I think, the technology, the clinical issues, the strategic and persuasive issues, in kind of interesting and largely unexplored ways.
And facilitating more information, because I think people love to look for information in various ways, but it's just not necessarily accessible to them. So, if there were things that could link people into additional sources and things.
Well, people love to search for information, but often not the information you're hoping they're going to search for.
Yeah.
So I think part of the issue, I think particularly in health, and particularly with a lot of the more challenging populations, is to how to piggyback. How to give people, well, a classic thing is some of the work on chess, where, I don't know if you're familiar with, it's one of the Seekers, the Wisconsin groups have this very well-evolved portal site on health. And a lot of it was done with AIDS patients and with disparities provided with computers. And one of the things we found was there was a tremendous kind of untapped market for sort of essentially social networking, especially if you have a serious chronic illness. And isolation is a major concern. And so by providing a portal that provided and support that technical capability provided networking with people, it was basically support groups, online support groups for people who were not in the social world that would typically have access to those. And it was that was tremendously successful. And also because you could monitor those and questions come up about or misinformation is being provided, so you're able to provide information while providing the service. So it becomes, there's a lot of interesting opportunities. They're not easy to pull off, and how to bring them to scale can be a real question too.
Mike, thank you so much for being here.